Last week, Father Bill got us started on Book 3, which is Christian Behavior, and we're going to continue with chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Book 3. So just a little review of what Father Bill talked about last week, just so we're kind of all up on things. At one point, Lewis makes the following remark that I think really is essential to understanding what he's talking about. And here it is. It's at the top of page 31 in your handout. Does it not make a difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? That is, in one sentence, Lewis has kind of like got us to focus on the center of all Christian behavior and thinking. And that is, essentially we have a choice, right? Either A, we're all our own persons, free to make our decisions as we see fit. We are our own standard for living. Or we're creatures of God and we live according to God's standards. And the idea here is I think Father Bill was trying to say in the sermon today, right, is that God's ultimate interest is actually in our true and lasting happiness. God really does want us to be happy literally forever. But he knows that very often our understanding of what constitutes happiness is pretty darn low, right? He knows that ultimately, right, what's going to conduce to our happiness is coming to know and love him above all things and through all things. That's the only thing that will finally ever make us truly happy. Everything else will promise happiness, but it won't deliver. And so if we, in effect, right, the danger of turning away from God means that we spend most of our lives chasing from one thing to the next that will finally make us happy. The next job, the next car, the next house, the next degree, the next set of friends, on and on and on and on. So that's the basic point of orientation for this whole for the whole of Book 3, is thinking about what it means to live that out. So let's take a look at chapter 4, which is titled Morality and Psychoanalysis. I know that doesn't sound very pleasant, but a word about it. At the time that Lewis did these talks, psychoanalysis was sort of becoming really, really popular. And there were people who actually thought that eventually psychoanalysis would sort of replace Christianity as a way of kind of helping people get their lives in order. You may have noticed that it didn't. So Lewis is trying to deal with that here, and he's trying to do it in a very constructive way. So I just want to summarize what Lewis says in chapter 4 very briefly, because my real interest is in the next two chapters, chapters 5 and 6. So Lewis begins by saying that there are a number of ways, a number of resources in dealing with what he calls managing the human machine. Obviously, and psychoanalysis would certainly be one. And he says that as we think about who we are, we have to remember that as human beings, we sort of have two elements of us that have to go together. Element number one is what you might call our passions, right? So as human beings, right, we are part of the animal kingdom, right? So we have kind of passions, desires, instincts that we sort of live upon. And if you don't believe that, think about what happens, think about your automatic reaction when someone cuts in front of you on Thomasville Road. You have an instinct to do certain things, right? And I know that most of you are completely sanctified, and your first instinct is to pray for that person, okay? But the idea here is that as physical creatures, right, we have desires, we have instincts, we have passions, and that's part of who we are. And the goal is not to get rid of those things, but to put them under proper management. And that gets us to the second part. That is, the thing that distinguishes us as human beings is we have the capacity for judgment. We have the capacity to stand back and say, you know what? I would dearly love to punch Jim in the nose because, he's such a self-satisfied, arrogant, I'm not talking about Jim Fleury, okay. Jim is like almost a saint, so I would never say anything bad about Jim. But I'm not going to do it right because I have the capacity to restrain myself. I have the capacity to exercise judgment. And I can have the capacity, right? In this moment, I really have a strong inclination to do X, but I have the capacity of judgment that says, don't do that now. And it's the capacity to live according to judgment right that actually makes us human beings. It's our capacity to rise above the merely instinctual that characterizes us as human beings, because it's the capacity that enables us to rise above the instinctual that enables us to truly be moral. In order to be moral, you have to be able to make judgments. You have to be able to exercise the virtue of temperance on passions and desires. So Lewis says that one of the things we have to recognize, right, is that as individuals, each one of us is dealing with a sort of a different set of passions, right? We're all different to some degree, and we all struggle with certain things, right? So some people struggle with a short temper. Some people struggle with an inherited inclination to depression. Some people struggle with all kinds of things, right, that are part of their constitution. And Lewis says, here's where we have to be really, really careful. Our inclination is going to be to think, right, that the person who has the kind of sunny, optimistic, outgoing, positive disposition, we're going to think of that person as moral, and we're going to think of the person who's constantly struggling with depression as somehow sinful. And Lewis says, no. Your passions, right, are part of who you are. The question is not what they are, but how you deal with them. And that's really, really important. Okay, just because somebody has a sunny outlook, always is positive, that doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean that they're necessarily moral. And just because somebody is struggling with depression, that in no way, shape, or form means that they're somehow lacking in grace or the Christian life. Right? Some of the greatest saints in the church, St. Teresa of Avila, for example, went through long periods where she felt that God basically had turned his back on her. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was the same way. So we have to be really, really careful, Lewis warns us at this point, that we don't confuse those two things. And so Lewis says here that one of the things we have to realize here is that all of us are sort of working with different raw materials, our own particular passions, our own particular desires. And the question is not what those raw materials are. Maybe God gave you the best disposition in the world. Maybe you're constantly struggling with depression. That's actually irrelevant. The question is, what are you doing with your raw material? And the thing is, right, and anyone who's done any spiritual direction knows this. The thing here, right, is the only person who really knows what's going on in each one of our souls is God himself. Right? Our tendency is to make pretty superficial judgments. You know, old so-and-so is grumpy every time I see him on Sunday morning. He must not be a good Christian. Well, I don't really know that, do I? I don't know what so-and-so is struggling with every day. And just because so-and-so, right, is really peppy and pleasant, that doesn't mean they're like really progressing on the Christian life. It actually could mean the opposite. Right? It could be, right, that someone's own wonderful disposition has made them actually fairly complacent. And they're sitting there saying, you know what? Every time I meet other people, I'm happy to see them and I always have wonderful things to say. Gosh, and I'm so much better than all the depressed and grumpy people that work in my office. Well, that's totally wrong, Lewis says. We can't see things in that way. And so Lewis says that the fundamental principle that's at work here is that with every decision we make, we're sort of either moving toward God or away from Him. With every decision we make, we're either moving closer to God or we're sort of moving further and further away from Him. And that's why all our choices and decisions are really important. Because they're not just choices, they're not just decisions, they're not just sort of like random things. With every choice and decision we make, what we're actually doing is we're actually forming and shaping our own souls, either for the good or for the bad. If you want a way of thinking about this, read Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. This is the central theme. Okay? There's one wonderful scene where there's a woman who in life has been like a real complainer. And so you see her and she's just grumbling about everything. She actually makes it into heaven and she's not particularly pleased with it. Because, she grumbled through life and she thought everything was wrong, and now she's in heaven and she thinks that's wrong too. And so she's going on and on and on, and Lewis has kind of written this out in a wonderful way. She just goes on and on about everything that's wrong. And somebody raises a question, this woman is sort of like in bad shape. And another bystander says, the real question is she a grumbler or is she simply a grumble? Has her grumbling totally eaten away her humanity so that there's no real human being left? Just kind of like a shrunken, shriveled, self-enclosed, self-focused, self-absorbed non-person. That's the question. Okay, so Lewis says, right, that we all have to be on our lookout that might happen to us. We might end up in that way. Okay, let's talk about sexual morality. And then we'll hopefully have time to talk about marriage as well. Now, remember, this talk was given in the 1940s. Okay, so obviously things have changed dramatically since then in a whole number of ways, right? And one of the ways that's changed dramatically, right, is that one of the chief dividing points even in churches today is on the issue of sexual morality. Christians no longer agree on what Christian teaching is on human sexuality. It has now become a sort of dividing force in the church. And we have denominations now that are trying to hold themselves together by basically saying, okay, look, we'll just agree to disagree on this subject. We'll just agree there really is no one teaching on Christian sexuality, and we'll all move on happily from there. And guess what happens? The church completely compromises its witness. Completely compromises it. So let's take a look at what Lewis has to say. First of all, Lewis says that Christian teaching on sexual morality isn't just simply a series of rules, although that's what a lot of people are inclined to think, right? And primarily they think that Christian teaching on sexual morality is a set of negative rules. Don't do this, don't think that, don't act on this, never do this, on and on and on. But Lewis says that Christian teaching on sexual morality actually begins with the second part of morality. Remember what that was? Internal harmony. Okay, that is, the idea here is that sin affects everything about us. Sin is a force of disorder, and it affects everything about us. It affects the way we think, it affects our desires, it affects our passions, and of course it certainly affects our sexuality. And we have to recognize that. And so, what Christianity is after is not just keeping a bunch of rules related to sex, but the process of us living into God's purposes for human sexuality. And the interesting thing, right, is that God has some very definite purposes for it. And this is another tragic aspect of the divisions in the church. We actually have some churches now saying, well, you know what? We can't really identify what God's purposes for human sexuality really are. We'll leave that up to you. So let's see what Lewis has to say. Lewis says that all of Christian sexual teaching comes under the heading of one word, and I want to see this word come back. It's kind of a word that people have made fun of. But the word is chastity. Chastity. Chastity is a moral virtue. And I'll try and describe it here for you. What chastity has to do with is, chastity has to deal not with prudery, although that, once again, that tends to be an association, right? So the chaste person is not the person who says, anytime some sexual idea or topic comes up, says, oh no, we're not going to talk about that. That's a no-no. No. The purpose of chastity, or the whole reality of chastity, is to help us live into God's purposes for human sexuality. That's the agenda here. And so let's see if we can figure out what that is. Now, the basic principle of chastity is this, and this is so simple. This is something that the church has taught for 2,000 years, but now there's wild disagreement on. But it's this. If you're married, for you, chastity means complete sexual fidelity to your spouse. No exceptions. The sacrament of marriage binds a man and a woman together, and it's a bond of undying loyalty and devotion. And so, for married people in the church, right, chastity means that you are completely loyal and faithful to your spouse. And if you remember the marriage liturgy, right, remember what that loyalty is a mirror of? Christ's loyalty to the church. The loyalty of husband and wife to one another in marriage mirrors Christ's loyalty to the church, Ephesians 5. If you're single, if you're not married, then you are called to celibacy. Now here's the thing, right? Neither one of those things is easy, is it? Neither complete loyalty to your spouse in marriage, nor celibacy as a single person, neither one of those things is easy. But the issue here is not whether it's hard or easy, it's what's God's purpose. And our task, right, Lewis says, is to live into God's purposes. Here's where we find, right, that as so many other things, right, the Christian life involves a continual struggle. Anybody that's been married for any length of time knows, right, that marriage is not simply uninterrupted bliss. Right? Sometimes it's like the opposite. And anybody that's been single for any length of time, right, and has struggled with their own desires knows that, well, that's a struggle too. But the idea here is we're trying to live into God's design. So what is that design? Well, Lewis, I think, states this design very succinctly. There's been a lot of writing about it recently, but it's this. And here's where I think we want to kind of really focus on what Lewis says. Lewis is this. He says that the sexual relationship between husband and wife is the physical sign of the covenant that exists between them. Okay, so the sexual relationship between a husband and wife is the physical and visible sign of the spiritual covenant that exists between them. Note the point here. No covenant, no sexual relationship. Really important, right? This is God's purpose. This isn't just a rule, right? Because, and here's the other part of it, God's design for human sexuality is that it be an act which involves the totality of our persons. So our relationship with our spouse, right, is physical, emotional, and spiritual, and God's purpose is not to split those three off and to take the physical and leave the spiritual and emotional parts behind. The attempt to do that always harms the person who does it. Right? We know now from survey after survey after survey that people who come into marriage after sort of multiple sexual experiences experience no end of difficulty. And that's simply because that's not God's design. And once again, right, we have to remember God's ultimate purpose is not our frustration, but our happiness. Okay, that's the idea here. So what we're trying to say here, to an over-sexualized culture, to a culture which has peeled off the spiritual and emotional aspects of sex and only wants to focus on the physical dimension, is we want to say the problem with that way of looking at things is, in addition to being wrong, it's subhuman. God's intention is that when we have sexual relations with someone, we are literally giving them ourselves. Our bodies, our souls, our emotions. Nothing is held back. That's what that act is supposed to be. One of my favorite parts of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer wedding service, and this is, back in the days when there'd only be one ring and the wife would take a vow of obedience, and some people kind of poo-poo that and saying, oh, women taking vows of obedience to their husbands, that's old-fashioned. But when the husband placed the ring on his wife's finger, he said the following words: "With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." With my body I thee worship. That's the idea, right? So this is Lewis, I think, trying to make this really important point. Another thing that Lewis says, I think that's really helpful, is he says that one of the things that's made Christian teaching on human sexuality really difficult these days, and once again he was saying this in the 1940s, is that our culture has become so overly sexualized. We live in an overly sexualized culture. This is particularly true now with the widespread advent of pornography, and I might add, the widespread advent of pornography addiction. According to the National Association of Christian Marriage Therapists, you know what the number one cause of marriage dysfunction is now? One person in the marriage is addicted to pornography. So it's a huge problem. And so we live in a kind of overly sexualized culture. And Lewis says in that culture, right, practicing the discipline of chastity is going to be very, very difficult, because we're presented with a kind of like a barrage of images. And, right, anyone who talks about chastity is basically going to be written off as kind of like a prude. Oh, well, that's old-fashioned, right? That's the way they did it way back in the Dark Ages. Stuff like that. But Lewis also notes here that another consequence of the over-sexualization of culture is that we're now sort of at sea as to what the purpose of marriage is. Another one of God's original purposes for marriage, remember, was procreation. Remember what happens at the end of the second chapter of Genesis? It's quoted in the Book of Common Prayer wedding service. "And a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh," one person. And of course, previously God has blessed them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it," right? The idea here is that one of God's purposes in marriage is procreation. And this explains why the church has always thought that heterosexual marriage was the norm. Because in order to arrive at procreation, right, You need a man and a woman who are distinct yet complementary, right? The interesting thing, the fascinating thing about men and women is that they're different and they're meant to go together. Their differences supplement one another. It's not coincidental that when the 1979 Book of Common Prayer was produced, the part in the marriage liturgy about marriage being for the purpose of procreation was essentially put in a footnote. And then 10 years later, General Convention starts talking about rights for the blessing of same-sex marriages. If procreation is not essential to marriage, that means it doesn't have to involve a man and a woman. It could be a romantic relationship between anyone of any number. Okay? And of course now, after the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision, marriage has become a civil right, definable by the individual. So that's kind of where we are today. Now, Lewis says here, and this is kind of the end of the discussion about sex, is that God's purpose is that sex finds its most healthy and fulfilling place in the context of the covenant of marriage, where body, soul, and spirit are kept together. And the problem here is, he says, we have to make an important distinction between natural sexual desire and lust. So let me say something about both those things very briefly. On one hand, right, we know that God has made us sexual creatures, right, because the first chapter of the book of Genesis tells us that. God created them male and female, complementary, together for one another, and therefore sexual desire is part of God's design for us. It's good, it's healthy, God has given it to us, we don't need to be ashamed of it. On the other hand, in an over-sexualized culture, right, natural sexual desire gets sort of fanned and inflamed into lust. A kind of like a preoccupation, okay? It's quite natural to look at someone of the opposite sex and think that they're attractive. It's a no other thing to do that. Okay? And when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, right, that, you know, if a man lusts after a woman, he's already committed adultery in her heart, right? What he's getting at is this. The thing that's bad about lust is what it does to you. Lust essentially dehumanizes the person you're looking at, right? This is the deadly thing about pornography, is that people come to look at other people merely as sort of like objects, such that the person you're looking at, right, might just very well be a car, a cut of meat, or a painting. You've taken away their humanity and reduced them now down into an object for your own enjoyment or pleasure. Notice what that does. To do that on a consistent basis makes it impossible to really love other people. Lust and love or charity work in opposite directions. The more lust is fanned up, the more we're sort of focused on ourselves. And it becomes literally impossible to love other people. Hence, the problems that pornography addiction creates in marriage. So that's the section on sexuality. I'm going to say a couple brief things about marriage, and then we'll finish. And I have to do something at 11:15, so we will definitely be done before then. Lewis says that the Christian ideal of marriage is stated in the book of Genesis. Once again, right? A man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one person. And that the relationship between husband and wife mirrors the relationship between Christ and the church. That's the Christian ideal of marriage. It involves a man and a woman because they're complementary, and they go together actually not in spite of their differences, but actually because of them. That's why you may remember in the second chapter of the book of Genesis, when God creates the woman, God's brought all these different creatures to him, and in effect has said, well, how would you like to have this for a partner? And brings a horse or a cat or a dog, and the man says, well, God, I appreciate the thought, but no. And then finally, the woman's created, and the man in effect says, this is the Michael Petty translation, the man says, okay, now we're talking. Yes. The idea here, right, is that on one hand, both these two creatures are human, but they represent kind of variations on human nature. And so they go together. That's the idea. The other thing here that Lewis says is that one of the reasons why Christians have been against the notion of divorce, once again, is not because of a concern for keeping little petty rules, but this. If marriage isn't simply like a contract between two people, but if it's more a covenant, a sacrament, then a divorce is not the canceling of a contract, it's the dismemberment of a person. And the man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then that's ripped apart. That clearly goes against God's purposes for what marriage is supposed to be. Lewis also says another thing that I think that's really kind of important here, and we'll close with this. Lewis says that basically there are two views of marriage, and I think he's still right about this. One view is what he calls the romantic understanding of marriage, and the other is the notion of the covenant understanding. So let me say a brief word about this. If you want to read more about this, read Tim Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage. This is basically the theme of the whole book. So the romantic notion of marriage is this. Boy meets girl. They fall madly and passionately in love. And the whole of their married life is one act of uninterrupted bliss. And they all live happily ever after. I don't recognize my own marriage in that story. Okay? And the idea right here is that because marriage is supposed to be one act of uninterrupted bliss, when you hit a dry spot, that becomes grounds for getting out. Hey, I'm sorry, but you know what? This just isn't working for me anymore. Let's think about something else. That is, Lewis says that if you enter into marriage with a kind of a romantic understanding marriage, you're setting yourself up for failure. Okay? It's like people, who graduate from seminary and they are just so excited to get out in their first church because they believe that they're going to passionately preach the word of God. Everybody's going to be devoted and listening. They'll be on fire for the gospel, and then they hit their first church and, become immensely discouraged. Okay? The second view of marriage is the covenant view. And so whenever couples are going through the premarital process here, I always remind them that. So now look, let's read together the vows of marriage in the prayer book. And I say this, look, notice here that you're promising to love and to cherish in sickness and health, for better, for worse, for richer or poor, until you are parted by death. Notice this, there is not one word in those vows about feeling. You're making a promise to treat your spouse in a certain way, whether you feel like it or not. Now, I hope, right, that you treat your spouse out of respect because you're madly in love with him or her. That's great. But you're not always going to feel that way. Marriage isn't simply about feelings. It's about covenant. It's about responsibility. It's about mutual dedication. It's about self-sacrifice. In short, it's about sanctification. And that's Tim Keller's point in the meaning of marriage. So I think that's the most important things that Lewis wants to say here. What we will do is next Sunday, we'll pick things up with chapter 7 on forgiveness. I don't know whether Lewis intended this or not, but it's interesting that the chapter on marriage is followed by the chapter on forgiveness. What's that?